Some people may look at this idea of conscious capitalism and simply view it as highly idealistic and not very practical, that the world of business is a rough and tumble, sort of dog-eat-dog kind of world. That's what we've always been taught, and that's the school of hard knocks and nice guys finish last and all of those kinds of metaphors that we have out there about business. We find that the reality is very different, that in fact this way of doing business is not only one that creates a great deal of well-being and happiness and contentment and so forth with different stakeholders, but that also it is in fact the secret to high performance. A number of studies have come out in recent years, including the one that we did in a book called Firms of Endearment, how world-class companies profit from passion and purpose. This came out 2 years ago. And in that book we found that we looked at 28 such companies, and we found that their performance over 10 years in financial terms exceeded the market by 9 to 1. 1,100% versus 123%. Now the interesting thing was that we did not set out to select companies that were financially outliers or are financially very successful. We selected them on the basis of all of these other criteria: their adherence to a higher purpose and their stakeholder orientation towards all stakeholders and the type of leadership that they exemplified and the cultures that they had. And only after selecting them on those criteria did we then look at their financial performance. And now the normal expectation there would be, if you come from a traditional, what we would call a zero-sum perspective on business, is that if you're paying your employees in some cases double what the competitors are paying, that if you're in fact covering healthcare benefits at a much higher rate, that if you're paying taxes at a higher rate, that if your suppliers are profitable, right, and if you're investing in community, your impact on the environment in fact is a net positive. If you're doing all of these things, then that has to come from somewhere. You're also investing in outstanding customer service, right? So that therefore it probably leaves less money on the table for investors, because investors get what's left over at the end after all those expenses have been met. So under a traditional view of business, you would expect that these companies would probably underperform in terms of their profits and their stock market returns. But that is a zero-sum view of the world. In fact, as I said, what we found was that they significantly and dramatically outperformed the overall market. Our analysis ended on June 30th of 2006, before the book was published. Now, we've looked at the performance of these companies subsequently, and we've also looked at them specifically since the global financial crisis started almost a year ago. And the companies, again, have significantly outperformed the market in both of those time frames as well. So what that says is there's a greater degree of resilience there in these downturns. But these companies do well relative to other businesses in all kinds of market conditions. So again, this is a highly practical way. What this says is there's no real trade-off between a business that has higher purposes and higher intentions and goodwill towards different stakeholders and performing well in terms of financial criteria. The second thing is that there really is a need, I think, as a society and as business schools, for us to look at businesses and evaluate their performance with a much broader set of criteria. Right now, we simply look at wealth creation. And we look at stock market appreciation, dividends, and things of that sort. But that's only one kind of wealth that companies create or destroy. Companies can also create or destroy social wealth or capital, emotional wealth, on the part of their employees, for example, and their customers, cultural wealth, intellectual wealth. You can even go so far as to say spiritual well-being as well is all impacted by corporations. And the larger the company, the greater its footprint on the world. So if you start to think of business performance as having all of these outcomes where you can be creating or destroying value of multiple kinds, it makes sense to look at all of them in totality and to say, well, okay, maybe we made this much money, the financial returns were this much, but at the same time we caused this much damage to the environment, right? We created some problems within the culture, we contributed to the diabetes crisis that we have and the obesity crisis that we have and the public health problems that we have, or we created various kinds of impacts on young women or on children, etc., through our advertising, which are negative. It's a much broader way, and therefore the word conscious that we use in describing conscious capitalism really has many dimensions to it. It really says that we are conscious, we are awake, we are mindful of all of the impacts that we have on the world, and that we think about the totality of all of that. And we recognize the interconnections and the interdependencies across that. One of the companies we have in our study is Whole Foods. And if you go to the Whole Foods website or any of their stores, you'll find something that they call the Declaration of Interdependence, which is an explicit recognition that we are in fact all connected with one another, that what's beneficial to one cannot come at the expense of somebody else. Because if you try to do that, then ultimately it's going to harm the whole system, including yourself. As a metaphor there's a cartoon that I use which shows a boat in which we have some people sitting at one end of it and the other end has sprung a leak, and there are some people desperately bailing out the water at that end, and the people sitting on the high end of the boat are saying, well, I'm sure glad the hole isn't in our end of the boat. Right? And the fact is that we are all in the same boat. And this attitude which we have had in the past and continue to have, which is that this is not our problem, or that, we can't pay our employees subsistence wage and have them on public assistance while we're delivering disproportionate returns to investors, that is acceptable. Those ways of thinking reflect a lower level of consciousness about what business can be and should be in the world.